She thought grief was the hardest truth, until she found the locked attic door. Inside his trunk lay 50 years of silence, and a life she never knew existed. If the person you loved most had hidden their entire past, would you want to know why, or let them rest in peace? The cottage looked smaller than Claire remembered. She stood in the gravel driveway, keys in one hand and a box of kitchen supplies in the other, staring at the weathered blue door that had always been part of their someday. Someday, when Robert retired. Someday, when they had time. Someday, when life slowed down enough to let them breathe. But someday had come too late, and now she was here alone. The door stuck when she pushed it open, swollen from years of salt air and coastal damp. Inside, the smell hit her first dust, old wood, and something faintly sweet, like dried lavender left too long in a drawer. The light filtering through the lace curtains was soft and golden, casting delicate shadows across the hardwood floor. Dust motes floated in the beams, slow and weightless, like they had all the time in the world. Claire set the box down by the door and stood still, listening. The house was silent except for the distant cry of gulls and the rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks below. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, pressing gently against her chest, reminding her she was the only heartbeat left in this place. Robert had loved this house. They'd bought it 40 years ago, just after they were married, with dreams of filling it with grandchildren someday, of sitting on the porch watching sunsets, of growing old together by the sea. But work had always gotten in the way. Robert's career as an engineer, her own years teaching middle school English, the endless excuses about timing and money, and "Not yet, Claire, not yet." And now he was gone. 6 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. She still counted. Claire moved through the house slowly, her footsteps echoing on the bare floors. The furniture was covered in white sheets, ghostly shapes she didn't have the energy to unveil. She trailed her fingers along the windowsill in the living room, collecting a fine layer of dust. In the bedroom, she found the box she'd shipped ahead, their clothes, their books, the small things she couldn't leave behind in the city apartment that had stopped feeling like home the day Robert collapsed in the kitchen. She opened the box carefully, her hands shaking slightly. On top was his gray cardigan, the one he wore every evening while reading the paper. She lifted it to her face and breathed in. Faintly, beneath the mustiness of storage, she could still smell him. Soap and coffee and something else she could never name. Something that was just Robert. Her throat tightened. She set the cardigan on the bed and turned away before the tears could come. She'd cried enough. The house needed unpacking. Life, somehow, needed to continue. It was while hanging clothes in the bedroom closet that she noticed it. A draft. Not strong, just a whisper of cool air brushing the back of her neck, coming from above. Claire stepped back and looked up. The ceiling was plain white, unbroken except for... She squinted. There, near the corner above the closet, was a faint square outline, barely visible. Painted over so many times the seam was almost invisible. An attic access panel. Claire frowned. She'd been in this house a dozen times over the years, but she'd never noticed it before. Then again, she'd never looked. Robert had always handled the maintenance, the repairs, the things that required ladders and tools. She remembered asking him once, years ago, if there was storage space upstairs. "Nothing worth going up there for," he'd said, not looking up from his newspaper. "Just leave it be, Claire." She hadn't questioned it. Now, standing alone beneath that hidden square, she wondered why. Claire found a stepladder in the garage, old and speckled with paint. She dragged it into the bedroom, positioned it beneath the panel, and climbed. Her hands were trembling again, though she wasn't sure why. The panel resisted at first, sealed with years of paint and humidity. She pushed harder, and it finally gave way with a soft crack, sliding to the side. Cool air rushed down, carrying the scent of old wood and something else, something strangely clean, like furniture polish. Claire hesitated, her hand on the edge of the opening. Then she pulled herself up. The attic was smaller than she expected, low-ceilinged and dim. Light filtered through a single circular window at the far end, illuminating a space that was surprisingly tidy. No cobwebs, no dust-covered boxes or forgotten junk. Just an empty wooden floor, swept clean. And in the center, directly beneath the window, sat a large leather travel trunk. It was old, the kind with brass corners and heavy buckles, the leather darkened with age but well cared for. The kind of trunk someone would take on a long journey and never want to lose. Claire's breath caught. She moved toward it slowly, her footsteps creaking on the old boards. The trunk was locked with a combination padlock, 4 brass dials worn smooth from use, and resting on top of the trunk, held down by a small stone, was a folded piece of paper. Claire's heart pounded as she picked it up. The handwriting was unmistakably Robert's neat, careful, the way he signed birthday cards and grocery lists. It said simply, "For Claire, when you're ready." She sank to her knees, the note trembling in her hands. Robert had been up here. Not once, but many times. Judging by how clean everything was, he'd kept this space, preserved it, hidden it from her for 40 years. And he'd left something for her to find. Claire stared at the trunk, her mind spinning. What could be inside? What had her husband, the man she'd shared a life with, a bed with, 1,000 ordinary mornings with, kept locked away all this time? Part of her wanted to climb back down, to leave it sealed, to let the past stay buried. But another part of her, the part that had spent 6 months asking questions no one could answer, needed to know. She reached for the lock, her fingers hovering over the dials. The combination. What would Robert have chosen? Claire sat on the attic floor for what felt like hours, staring at the trunk. The note lay beside her, Robert's careful handwriting catching the light from the circular window. For Claire. When you're ready. But was she ready? She didn't know. The attic was silent except for the faint whistle of wind through the eaves and the distant rhythm of the ocean. Dust motes drifted lazily through the single shaft of sunlight, and everything felt suspended, as if time itself was holding its breath. Claire reached out slowly, her fingers brushing the worn leather. The trunk was heavy, solid, real. Not a dream, not a mistake. Robert had left this for her, which meant he'd known that someday she would be here alone, searching for answers he'd never given her while he was alive. She couldn't stay up here. The attic felt too small, too close. The air too thick with the weight of what she was about to uncover. Claire climbed back down the ladder, steadied herself, then dragged the trunk to the edge of the opening. It was heavier than it looked, and she had to lower it carefully, her arms shaking with the effort. When it finally thudded onto the bedroom floor, she stood there, breathing hard, staring at it like it might disappear if she blinked. Then she dragged it into the living room, where the afternoon light was softer, kinder. She needed light for this. She needed air. Claire set the trunk on the floor in front of the fireplace and knelt beside it. The combination lock gleamed dully in the sunlight, 4 brass dials, each numbered 0 through 9. Her mind raced. What would Robert have chosen? She tried their wedding anniversary first, the 12th of June, 2083. The lock didn't budge. Her hands were trembling now, her pulse loud in her ears. She tried Robert's birthday, the 4th of November 2055. Nothing. Claire sat back on her heels, her throat tight. Think, she told herself. Think. What date mattered most to him? And then, Almost without meaning to, she tried the day they met. July 15th, 1973. The 15th of July, 2073. She turned the dials slowly, carefully. The last number clicked into place, and the lock opened with a soft, final snick. Claire's breath caught. She stared at the lock for a long moment, her hand frozen on the latch. This was it. Whatever Robert had hidden, whatever he'd kept from her for 40 years, it was right here. She could still walk away, close the trunk, pretend she'd never found it. But she knew she wouldn't. She had to know. Claire lifted the lid. The hinges creaked softly, and the smell of old leather and paper rose up to meet her. Inside, everything was meticulously organized. The top layer held stacks of letters, bound together with faded string. The envelopes were yellowed with age, addressed in handwriting she didn't recognize. Beneath the letters were black and white photographs, dozens of them, loose and overlapping. She picked one up carefully. It showed a narrow cobblestone street lined with old buildings, their facades scarred and crumbling. The sign on the corner was in a language she couldn't read, blocky Cyrillic letters stark against the pale stone. Eastern Europe, maybe. But Robert had never been to Eastern Europe. He'd always said he had no interest in traveling abroad, that he was happy staying close to home. Claire set the photograph down and reached for another. This one showed a young man standing in front of a gray apartment building. He was maybe 16 or 17, thin and serious, his dark eyes staring directly at the camera. Claire's heart stopped. The young man was Robert, but it couldn't be. Robert at 16 would have been in Ohio, living with his parents, going to high school. This boy was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere cold and foreign and far away. Claire's hands shook as she set the photograph aside and dug deeper into the trunk. Beneath the photos was a passport. She pulled it out slowly, her pulse pounding. The cover was worn, the pages soft with age. She opened it carefully. The photograph inside was unmistakably Robert, same strong jaw, same dark hair, same serious expression. But the name beneath the photo wasn't Robert Ashford. It read, Viktor Sokolov. Claire stared at the name, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. Viktor Sokolov. Who was Viktor Sokolov? She set the passport down and kept searching, her movements frantic now. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in a piece of faded silk, was a small wooden box. Claire lifted it carefully and opened the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, was a wedding ring. Gold, simple, engraved on the inside with words in a language she didn't recognize. It wasn't hers. Robert had been married before. The thought hit her like a blow to the chest, stealing her breath. She'd asked him once, early in their relationship, if he'd ever been married. He'd laughed and said, "You're my first and only, Claire." But this ring said otherwise. Beneath the wooden box, at the very bottom of the trunk, was a leather journal. The cover was worn smooth, the edges frayed. Embossed on the front in faded gold letters were the words, "The life I left behind." Claire's hands trembled as she lifted it from the trunk. The leather was soft, warm under her fingers, as if it had been held often, read often, loved. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was Robert's, but younger, less steady. The ink was faded but still legible. It began, "My name is Robert Ashford," but it wasn't always. "This is the story of the man I was before I became the man you loved, and the family I had to leave behind to keep them safe." Claire's vision blurred. She closed the journal and pressed it against her chest, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Robert had another name, another life, another family. Everything she thought she knew about him, every story, every memory, Every quiet morning and ordinary evening suddenly felt like a lie. Or worse, like only half the truth. She looked down at the trunk, at the scattered photographs and letters, at the ring that belonged to someone else, and she realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that she had never really known her husband at all. Claire didn't move for a long time. She sat on the floor of the living room, the journal open in her lap, Robert's words staring up at her like a confession she wasn't ready to hear. My name is Robert Ashford, but it wasn't always. The light through the lace curtains had turned golden, then orange, then gray. Hours had passed without her noticing. She finally turned the page. I was born Viktor Sokolov in East Berlin on November 4th, 1945. My father, Dmitri, was a Soviet intelligence officer. My mother, Greta, was a German nurse who worked at the military hospital. They met during the occupation, and somehow, against all logic, they fell in love. I grew up in a small apartment on Schönhauser Alley, where the walls were thin and the neighbors whispered. My father taught me Russian. My mother taught me German. And both of them taught me how to keep secrets. Claire's hands trembled as she read. Viktor Sokolov. The name felt foreign in her mind. Impossible to connect to the man she'd shared a bed with for 40 years. But the handwriting was his. The voice, even on the page, was his. By the time I was 10, I knew my parents were part of something dangerous. People came to our apartment late at night, refugees, mostly. My mother would give them forged papers. My father would arrange safe passage. They were helping people escape. I didn't understand the risk until I was older, but I knew enough to stay quiet. To pretend I didn't see the strangers in our kitchen, didn't hear the whispered conversations in the dark. We were good at pretending. Claire wiped her eyes and kept reading. In the summer of 1961, everything changed. The government had been tightening controls for months. The borders were closing. My parents knew their network had been compromised, but they kept working, kept helping people cross. They believed it was worth the risk. On August 12th, 1961, one day before the wall went up, Soviet agents came to our apartment. I was 16. They took my parents into the street. My mother was crying. My father told me to run. I didn't. I stood at the window and watched them execute my parents in the middle of the road. Claire's breath caught. She closed her eyes, but the image Robert Victor had described was already burned into her mind. A 16-year-old boy watching his parents die. I don't remember how I got out of the apartment. I don't remember much of the next 3 days. What I remember is waking up in West Berlin, in a safe house run by American operatives. They told me I couldn't go back. They told me my name was gone, that Viktor Sokolov was dead now, just like his parents. They gave me a new identity. Robert Ashford, born in Ohio. No family, no history. They relocated me to the United States in 1962. I was 17 years old, and I didn't speak English. Claire set the journal down, her hands shaking too badly to hold it. Robert had never told her any of this. Not a word. Not in 40 years. She thought about all the times she'd asked him about his childhood, his family, his past. He'd always smiled and said, "Nothing interesting, Claire. Just a boring kid from Ohio." She'd believed him. Why wouldn't she? Claire stood slowly, her legs stiff from sitting so long. She walked to the window and stared out at the darkening ocean, trying to process what she'd just read. Robert had watched his parents die. He'd been smuggled out of East Berlin as a refugee. He'd lived under a false identity his entire adult life, and he'd never told her. She wanted to be angry, wanted to feel betrayed, but all she felt was a deep, aching sorrow. For the boy who'd lost everything, for the man who'd carried that loss alone. Claire returned to the trunk and picked up the stack of letters. They were tied with string, the envelopes yellowed and brittle. The return address was somewhere in East Germany, written in Cyrillic script. She untied the string carefully and opened the first letter. The handwriting was small, neat, hurried. Dearest Victor, I received your letter. I cannot tell you how it felt to know you are alive. For so long, I believed you were gone, like Mama and Papa. I am safe here. They do not suspect. I have kept your secret. Please do not try to come back. It is too dangerous. I would rather know you are alive somewhere far away than risk losing you again. Your sister, Anya. Claire's throat tightened. Robert had a sister he'd left behind. A sister who'd written to him in secret for years, knowing she might never see him again. Claire read letter after letter, each one achingly brief, each one filled with love and loss. Anya wrote about her life, small, careful details, a new job, a neighbor's kindness, the weather. She never asked Victor to come back. She only asked him to stay safe. The last letter was dated 1995. Victor, I am not well. The doctors say it is my heart. I do not know how much time I have left. I want you to know that I forgave you long ago for leaving. You had no choice. You were always the brave one. I had a daughter. Her name is Katya. She is 22 now, strong and beautiful. She does not know about you. I thought it was safer that way. But I kept the photograph you sent me when she was a baby. I will leave it for her, so that someday she might know she had an uncle who loved her, even from so far away. Be happy, Victor. You deserve that much. Anya. Claire's vision blurred. She looked at the date on the letter again. November 1995. She remembered that month. Robert had been distant, withdrawn. She'd asked him what was wrong, and he'd said it was work stress. She'd believed him. But now she knew. He'd been mourning his sister in silence, unable to tell Claire why. Claire reached back into the trunk, her hands shaking. Tucked between the pages of the journal was a photograph. She pulled it out carefully. It showed a young woman, maybe in her 30s, standing in front of a gray apartment building. She was holding a baby, wrapped in a knitted blanket. The woman's face was serious, but her eyes were kind. Claire turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, were the words, Anya and Katya, 1979. They are safe. I will never see them again. Claire sank to the floor. The photograph clutched in her hands. Robert had a niece named Katya, who would be in her 60s now. A woman who had no idea her uncle had survived, had built a life, had loved someone. A woman who might still be alive. Somewhere in Germany, carrying Robert's blood, his history, his loss. And Claire was the only one who knew. She looked back at the trunk, her heart pounding. And that's when she saw it. At the very bottom, beneath the letters and photographs, was one more envelope. Larger than the others, sealed with wax. And on the front, in Robert's careful handwriting, was a single word. Claire. Claire stared at the envelope for a long time before she touched it. Her name, written in Robert's handwriting, clear and deliberate. Claire. The wax seal had cracked with age, red flakes clinging to the paper like dried blood. She picked it up carefully, her hands shaking. Outside, the ocean had turned dark. The room was lit only by the dying light through the windows and the single lamp she'd turned on hours ago. She broke the seal. Inside was a single folded letter, the paper thick and cream-colored, the kind Robert used for important things. Claire unfolded it slowly, her breath shallow. The handwriting was his, but older, less steady than the journal, as if he'd written it when he was tired or afraid. It began, "My dearest Claire, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you found what I spent 40 years trying to protect you from. I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. I know you deserve more than apologies and explanations left in a trunk, but I need you to understand why I kept this from you. I was afraid." Claire's throat tightened. She kept reading. "Not afraid of you. Never of you. I was afraid that if you knew the truth about who I was, about Victor, about my parents, about everything I left behind, you would see me differently. You would see the boy who watched his parents die and did nothing. You would see the man who abandoned his sister to save himself. You would see the coward I've always been. And I couldn't bear that. I couldn't bear losing you because of the man I used to be." Claire wiped her eyes, her vision blurring. Robert had thought she would leave him. He'd thought the truth would break them. "I met you in 1973, 2 weeks after I ran from the only other person who knew who I really was. Her name was Liesel." Claire's breath caught. She looked back at the trunk, at the bundle of letters she hadn't yet touched, the ones in German. Liesel was the daughter of a German-American family in Ohio. We met at a church social in 1970. She was kind, patient, and for the first time since I'd left Berlin, I felt like I could breathe. I told her everything. About Victor, about my parents, about the life I'd left behind. She didn't run. She held my hand and told me it didn't matter. For 3 years, I believed her. I thought maybe I could be happy, that maybe the past didn't have to follow me forever. But in 1973, her father discovered who I really was. Claire's hands trembled. She turned the page. Liesel's father had been a low-ranking Nazi officer during the war. He'd fled to America under a false identity, just like me. When he found out I was the son of a Soviet officer, he panicked. He thought I was a spy. He threatened to expose me to people who were still hunting defectors. I had to leave. I packed a bag, wrote Liesel a letter I never sent, and disappeared overnight. 2 weeks later, I met you at the library. You smiled at me, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was running. I felt like I'd finally stopped. Claire closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. She'd always wondered why Robert had seemed so quiet, so careful, when they first met. She'd thought he was shy, but he'd been broken. And she'd been the one who made him feel whole again. Claire set the letter down and reached for the bundle of letters tied with string, the ones in German. She untied them slowly and pulled out the first envelope. The return address was Munich. The postmark was 1970. She opened it carefully and pulled out her phone, opening the translation app. The handwriting was delicate, slanted. "My dearest Victor, I cannot stop thinking about you. About the way you looked at me last night, like you were seeing me for the first time. You are not the man you think you are. You are not broken. You are not a coward. You are the bravest person I have ever known. I love you. Liesel." Claire's chest ached. She read letter after letter, each one filled with love, hope, and quiet desperation. Liesel writing about their future, about the life they would build together. And then, in 1973, the tone changed. "Victor, my father knows. I don't know how, but he knows about Berlin, about your parents, about who you were. He says you're dangerous, that you'll bring trouble to our family. I told him he was wrong, but he won't listen. Please, we can figure this out. We can leave together. We can go somewhere he'll never find us. I love you. That's all that matters. Liesel." Claire's hands shook as she reached for the next letter. It was dated 2 weeks later. The envelope had been opened, then resealed. On the front, in faded ink, were the words, "Return to sender." Claire pulled out the single page inside. "Victor, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I understand why you had to go. I understand that you were trying to protect me. I just wish you had let me protect you too. I hope wherever you are, you find peace. I hope you find someone who makes you feel safe. I love you. I always will. Liesel." Claire set the letter down, her vision blurred with tears. Robert had loved this woman. Deeply. Completely. And he'd walked away from her to keep her safe. Just like he'd walked away from his sister. Just like he'd kept the truth from Claire. Claire picked up Robert's letter again, her hands trembling. There was more. "Claire, I need you to know that I didn't choose you because I was running from Liesel. I chose you because when I looked at you, I saw a future I'd stopped believing in. You were my second chance, my fresh start, and I loved you more than I've ever loved anyone. But I was selfish. I kept my past from you because I was afraid. And now you're reading this, and I can't tell you I'm sorry. I can't hold you and explain. I can only leave you with this. At the bottom of the trunk, there's a manila envelope marked 1995 final contact. That's the year my sister Anya died. I found out through a contact in Berlin. I couldn't go to her funeral. I couldn't even send flowers. I spent that entire November wishing I could tell you why I was falling apart. But I couldn't. Because telling you would have meant telling you everything. And I was still too much of a coward to do that. I'm sorry, Claire, for all of it. I love you. I always have. Robert." Claire folded the letter carefully and pressed it against her chest, her body shaking with sobs. Robert had carried all of this alone. For 40 years, and she'd never known. She reached back into the trunk, her hands moving through the contents until she found the manila envelope. It was marked in Robert's handwriting, 1995 final contact. Claire opened it slowly. Inside was a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The text was in German. She held it up to her phone, translating line by line. It was an obituary. Anya Sokolova, age 52, died November 18th, 1995, in Berlin. She is survived by her daughter, Katya. Claire's hand shook. November 1995. She remembered that month vividly. Robert had been distant, withdrawn. He'd stopped eating, stopped sleeping. She'd asked him what was wrong, and he'd said, "Just work stress, Claire. I'll be fine." But he hadn't been fine. He'd been mourning his sister, alone, in silence. And Claire had believed his lie because she'd trusted him. She set the obituary down and stared at the photograph of Anya and baby Katya. They are safe. I will never see them again. Claire wiped her eyes and looked back at the trunk. At the letters, the photographs, the passport with Viktor Sokolov's name. At the life Robert had lived before he became the man she loved. And she realized, with a deep, aching clarity, that she had a choice to make. She could honor Robert's silence, pack the trunk away, and let the past stay buried. Or she could finish what he couldn't. She could find Katya and tell her that her uncle had survived, that he'd loved her, even from across the world, that he'd never forgotten. Claire stood slowly, her legs unsteady. She walked to the window and stared out at the dark ocean, the waves crashing against the rocks below. The weight of Robert's life pressed against her chest, heavy and suffocating. But beneath the weight, there was something else. A strange, fragile sense of purpose. Robert had spent his entire life protecting the people he loved. Maybe it was time someone protected his memory. Claire didn't leave the cottage for 3 days. She moved through the rooms like a ghost, the journal and letters scattered across the living room floor. Robert's life laid out in pieces she was still trying to fit together. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him not as the man she'd known, but as the boy he'd been, standing at a window in East Berlin, watching his parents die. She saw him running, hiding, changing his name and his past, building a new life on top of the ruins of the old one. And she saw him with Liesel, loving someone openly for the first time, only to lose her because of who he'd been. Then she saw him meeting her Claire at the library in 1973, 2 weeks after his heart had been broken. Had he loved her? Or had she just been convenient? Safe? She replayed every moment of their marriage, searching for the truth beneath the surface. The way Robert never wanted to travel to Europe. How he'd always made excuses too expensive, too crowded. Maybe someday. She'd thought he was just a homebody. Now she knew he was afraid. Afraid of being recognized. Afraid of the past catching up. She remembered the night they'd watched a documentary about the Berlin Wall. Robert had stood abruptly, his face pale, and left the room. "Are you okay?" she'd called after him. "Fine," he'd said. "Just tired." But he hadn't been fine. He'd been 16 again, watching his world collapse. And she'd never known. Claire sat on the floor of the attic, surrounded by the remnants of Viktor Sokolov's life, and felt a grief so deep it hollowed her out. Not grief for Robert's death, grief for the life he'd carried alone. For the secrets he'd kept because he thought she couldn't handle them. For the boy who'd never been allowed to grieve his parents, the young man who'd never been allowed to love freely, the husband who'd spent 40 years pretending he was someone else. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered into the empty attic. Her voice cracked. "I could have loved all of you." But even as she said it, she wondered if it was true. If Robert had told her the truth about Victor, about his parents, about Liesel, would she have stayed? Or would she have been afraid, too? She thought about the ring she'd found, the one that wasn't hers. The engraving on the inside, in a language she didn't speak. She'd looked it up online, translating the words letter by letter. "Für immer dein, forever yours." Robert had given that ring to someone else. He'd promised someone else forever, and then he'd walked away. Claire stared at the ring, turning it over in her fingers. Part of her wanted to be angry, wanted to feel betrayed, but all she felt was sadness. Because Robert had never been free. Not from his past, not from his fear. Not even with her. On the 4th day, Claire finally forced herself to eat. She made tea and toast, sitting at the small kitchen table, staring out at the gray ocean. The trunk sat in the living room, still open, still waiting. She'd gone through everything now, read every letter, studied every photograph. But there was one thing she hadn't decided yet. What to do about Katya, Robert's niece, Anya's daughter. A woman who had no idea her uncle had survived, had built a life, had loved someone. Claire picked up the photograph of Anya and baby Katya, studying the young woman's face. She looked like Robert. Same dark eyes, same serious expression. Katya would be in her 50s now. Maybe married, maybe with children of her own. A whole life lived in Germany, carrying Robert's blood and history without ever knowing it. Claire set the photograph down and pressed her hands against her temples. If she reached out, if she told Katya the truth, what would happen? Would Katya be grateful? Angry? Would she even believe it? And what right did Claire have to upend this woman's life with a story about an uncle who'd never tried to contact her? But then again, what right did she have to keep it buried? Claire stood and walked back to the attic. She needed to be sure she'd found everything, that there were no more secrets waiting. She knelt beside the trunk and ran her hands along the bottom, feeling for hidden compartments, loose panels. Her fingers caught on something. A seam. Claire's heart pounded as she pried at the edge, her nails digging into the leather. The false bottom lifted, revealing a narrow space beneath. Inside was a single envelope, sealed with red wax. Claire's breath caught. On the front, in Robert's handwriting, were the words, "Open only if you want to find them." Her hands shook as she broke the seal. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a photograph. Claire unfolded the paper first. It was an address, handwritten in Robert's careful script. Katya Sokolova, Schönhauser Alley, 128, Berlin, Germany. Beneath the address was a date, December 2023. 6 months before Robert died. Claire stared at the date, her mind racing. Robert had been tracking Katya, keeping tabs on her. He'd known where she lived, what her life looked like, but he'd never reached out. Why? Claire picked up the photograph. It showed a woman in her early 50s, standing in front of a small bakery. She was smiling, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes warm and familiar. On the back, in Robert's handwriting, were the words, "Katya, April 2023. She looks like Anya." Claire's throat tightened. Robert had found her. He'd seen her, or at least seen photographs of her, and he'd kept it to himself. But he'd also left this envelope for Claire, which meant he wanted her to know. He wanted her to have the choice he'd never been able to make. Claire sat on the attic floor, the photograph in one hand, the address in the other. She thought about Katya, living her life in Berlin, unaware that her uncle had survived, had spent decades thinking about her from across the world. She thought about Anya, dying without ever knowing her brother had escaped. She thought about Robert, carrying all of this alone until his heart finally gave out. And she realized, with a cold, heavy certainty, that she had a choice to make. She could honor Robert's silence, pack the trunk away, burn the address, and let the past stay buried. Or she could do what Robert couldn't. She could reach out to Katya, tell her the truth, and finish the story Robert had spent his entire life trying to protect. Claire stood slowly, her legs unsteady. She walked downstairs, the photograph and address clutched in her hands. In the living room, the fire was still burning low, embers glowing softly in the grate. It would be so easy. Just toss the paper into the flames, watch it curl and blacken and disappear. Let Robert's secret die with him. Claire knelt in front of the fireplace, her hand hovering over the fire. The heat licked at her fingers. She thought about Robert's letter, his final words. "I'm sorry, Claire, for all of it." And she thought about the boy who'd watched his parents die, the man who'd spent his life running, the husband who'd loved her enough to let her live without his ghosts. Claire pulled her hand back. She couldn't do it. She couldn't let this story end in silence. She stood and walked to the small desk by the window. She pulled out a sheet of paper and a pen, and she began to write. "Dear Katya, my name is Claire Ashford. You don't know me, but I believe I knew your uncle." Her hand trembled as she wrote, the words spilling out faster than she could think them through. She didn't know if this was the right choice. She didn't know if Katya would even respond. But she knew, with a deep, unshakable certainty, that this was what Robert had wanted. He'd left the address for her. He'd left the choice. And now she was making it. Claire spent the next 2 weeks in a kind of limbo. She couldn't send the letter, but she couldn't throw it away either. It sat on the desk by the window, sealed in an envelope addressed to Katya Sokolova, Berlin, Germany. Every morning, Claire would pick it up, her hand hovering over her coat pocket. Every morning, she would set it back down. The cottage felt smaller with each passing day. The walls closed in, the silence grew heavier, and the trunk in the living room seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, a constant reminder of the choice she still hadn't made. She stopped answering the phone when it rang, stopped checking her email. The outside world felt distant, unreal, like something happening to someone else. All that mattered was the letter, the photograph of Katya, and the question that looped endlessly through her mind. What gives me the right? On the 10th day, Claire called a private investigator in Berlin. She didn't know why. Maybe she needed proof that Katya was real, that this wasn't just some ghost from Robert's past. The investigator's name was Henrik. His voice was calm, professional, unimpressed by her story. "I need you to confirm someone's location," Claire said, her voice shaking. "I have a name and an address." "Of course. Send me what you have." Claire emailed him the address, the photograph, everything. 2 days later, Henrik called back. "Katya Sokolova," he said. "Age 65. Works as a librarian at a community center in Prenzlauer Berg. Lives alone. No criminal record. Quiet life." Claire's hands tightened around the phone. Did you see her?" "I took photographs. I'll send them." When the email arrived, Claire opened it with trembling hands. There were 3 photographs. Katya standing outside a small library, a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. Katya at a cafe, reading a book, her face calm and serious. Katya walking down a tree-lined street, the late afternoon sun catching in her dark hair. Claire stared at the images, her throat tight. Katya looked like Robert. The same strong jaw, the same thoughtful expression, the same sadness in her eyes. Claire drafted a dozen letters. Each one felt wrong. Too formal, too personal, too much, not enough. "Dear Katya, my name is Claire Ashford. I was married to a man named Robert, but his real name was Viktor Sokolov, and I believe he was your uncle. Delete. Dear Katya, you don't know me, but I know your family. I know your mother, Anya. I know what happened in 1961. I know that your uncle survived. Delete. Dear Katya, I'm writing to tell you something that will change your understanding of your family. Please forgive me. Delete." Claire sat at the desk, staring at the blank page, and felt the weight of every word she couldn't write. What if Katya didn't believe her? What if she did, and it destroyed her? What right did Claire have to rewrite this woman's life? If you've been following her story this far, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that remind us that even in the darkest storms, the truth is the only thing that keeps us afloat. The storm came on the 15th night. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through the eaves, rattling the old cottage like it was trying to shake something loose. Claire sat in the attic, surrounded by Robert's things, unable to sleep. The journal lay open in her lap, the pages soft and worn from her constant reading. She turned to the final entry, the one Robert had written just before he sealed the trunk. "If you're reading this, Claire, then I'm gone. And you've found what I spent my entire life trying to protect you from. I hope you can forgive me. I hope you understand that I kept these secrets not because I didn't trust you, but because I loved you too much to burden you with my past. But if you've opened the envelope at the bottom of the trunk, if you've found Katya's address, then you're making a choice I never had the courage to make. I'm proud of you for that. Whatever you decide, I'll understand. I love you, Claire. Always." Claire closed the journal and pressed it against her chest. "You bastard," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You left me to do this alone." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. Robert had left her everything she needed, the letters, the photographs, the address. He'd given her the choice because he trusted her in a way he'd never trusted himself. Claire stood and walked to the small window, staring out at the storm-dark ocean. Lightning flashed over the water, illuminating the waves crashing against the rocks below. She thought about Robert standing on this same cliff, watching the same ocean, carrying the weight of Viktor Sokolov's life. She thought about the boy who'd watched his parents die, the young man who'd loved Liesel and lost her, the husband who'd spent 40 years pretending he was someone else. And she thought about Katya, living her quiet life in Berlin, unaware that her uncle had survived, had thought about her, had loved her from across the world. Claire closed her eyes, and she remembered something Robert had said to her once, years ago, after a fight she could barely recall. They'd been arguing about something small money, maybe, or plans for the weekend, and she'd been angry, ready to walk away. Robert had caught her hand gently and said, "The hardest part of love is knowing when to hold on and when to let go." She'd thought he was talking about their argument, but now she understood. He'd been talking about himself, about Anya, about Liesel, about Viktor, about all the people he'd had to let go of to survive. And now it was Claire's turn to decide. Hold on to Robert's secret, or let it go. She walked downstairs slowly, her legs unsteady. The letter sat on the desk, waiting. Claire picked it up and stared at the address one more time. Then she put on her coat, grabbed an umbrella, and walked out into the storm. The post office was closed, but there was a mailbox on the corner, blue and battered by wind and salt. Claire stood in front of it, rain soaking through her coat, the letter clutched in her hands. She thought about Robert one last time, about the life they'd built together, the mornings and evenings, the quiet moments, the love that had been real, even if it was built on silence. And she thought about Katya, about the woman who looked like Robert, who carried his blood, his history, his sadness, a woman who deserved to know she wasn't alone. Claire took a breath, and she dropped the letter into the mailbox. The metal slot clanged shut, and it was done. Claire stood there for a long time, rain streaming down her face, mixing with tears she didn't bother to wipe away. She didn't know if she'd made the right choice. She didn't know if Katya would respond, or if the letter would even reach her. But she knew one thing. She'd done what Robert couldn't. She'd told the truth. And now all she could do was wait. Claire stood and walked to the small window, staring out at the storm-dark ocean. Lightning flashed over the water, illuminating the waves crashing against the rocks below. She thought about Robert standing on this same cliff, watching the same ocean, carrying the weight of Viktor Sokolov's life. She thought about the boy who'd watched his parents die, the young man who'd loved Liesel and lost her, the husband who'd spent 40 years pretending he was someone else. And she thought about Katya, living her quiet life in Berlin, unaware that her uncle had survived, had thought about her, had loved her from across the world. Claire closed her eyes, and she remembered something Robert had said to her once, years ago, after a fight she could barely recall. They'd been arguing about something small money, maybe, or plans for the weekend, and she'd been angry, ready to walk away. Robert had caught her hand gently and said, "The hardest part of love is knowing when to hold on and when to let go." She'd thought he was talking about their argument, but now she understood. He'd been talking about himself, about Anya, about Liesel, about Viktor, about all the people he'd had to let go of to survive. And now it was Claire's turn to decide. Hold on to Robert's secret, or let it go. She walked downstairs slowly, her legs unsteady. The letter sat on the desk, waiting. Claire picked it up and stared at the address one more time. Then she put on her coat, grabbed an umbrella, and walked out into the storm. The post office was closed, but there was a mailbox on the corner, blue and battered by wind and salt. Claire stood in front of it, rain soaking through her coat, the letter clutched in her hands. She thought about Robert one last time, about the life they'd built together, the mornings and evenings, the quiet moments, The love that had been real, even if it was built on silence. And she thought about Katya. About the woman who looked like Robert, who carried his blood, his history, his sadness. A woman who deserved to know she wasn't alone. Claire took a breath, and she dropped the letter into the mailbox. The metal slot clanged shut, and it was done. Claire stood there for a long time, rain streaming down her face, mixing with tears she didn't bother to wipe away. She didn't know if she'd made the right choice. She didn't know if Katya would respond, or if the letter would even reach her. But she knew one thing. She'd done what Robert couldn't. She'd told the truth. And now all she could do was wait. Claire sent the letter the next morning. This time, the wait was shorter. 5 days later, Katya called. Claire's hands shook as she answered the phone. Mrs. Ashford? The voice was soft, accented, careful. Yes. Katya? Yes. A pause. I read your letter. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Claire said quietly. I know this is overwhelming. My whole life, I thought I had no one, Katya said, her voice breaking. And now you tell me I had an uncle, that he survived, that he thought about me. He did more than think about you, Claire said. He kept every letter your mother sent him. He wrote about you in his journal. He found your address and kept your photograph. He loved you, Katya, even from so far away. There was a long silence. Then Katya said, May I come? To see where he lived? To understand? Claire's throat tightened. Yes, of course. Whenever you're ready. Katya arrived 3 weeks later, on a gray afternoon in early autumn. Claire waited by the window, watching the road, her heart pounding. When the car pulled into the driveway, Claire's breath caught. The woman who stepped out was unmistakably Robert's blood. Same dark hair, now streaked with silver. Same strong jaw. Same sad, searching eyes. Claire opened the door before Katya could knock. They stood there for a moment, staring at each other. Then Katya's face crumpled, and she whispered, He looked like me? You look like him, Claire said, tears streaming down her face. And they embraced, two strangers bound by a man neither of them had fully known, grieving together for the first time. They spent hours in the cottage, going through the trunk. Claire showed Katya the journal, the letters, the photographs. Katya held each item carefully, reverently, her hands trembling. When she saw the photograph of herself as a baby, held by her mother, she broke down completely. She never told me, Katya whispered. She carried this her whole life, and she never told me. She was protecting you, Claire said gently, just like Victor was protecting her. Katya looked up, her eyes red. Did he have a good life? Was he happy? Claire thought about Robert, about the quiet man who'd loved her, who'd built a life on silence and fear. He was safe, Claire said finally. And I think, in his way, he was happy, but he was never free. Katya nodded slowly. Neither was my mother. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Katya said, Thank you for telling me, for giving me this. Claire reached across and took her hand. He wanted you to know. That's why he left the address. He trusted me to do what he couldn't. Katya squeezed her hand tightly. I wish I could have met him. So do I, Claire whispered. Before Katya left, they planted a tree together in the garden overlooking the sea. A young oak, strong and stubborn, its roots sinking deep into the rocky soil. For Victor, Katya said quietly, and for Robert. The same man, but 2 lives. Claire nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. They stood side by side, watching the sun set over the ocean. And for the first time since Robert's death, Claire felt something other than grief. She felt peace, not because the pain was gone, but because she'd done what Robert asked. She'd told the truth, and in doing so, she'd given him back his name. 3 months after Katya's visit, Claire woke to the first snow of the season. It fell softly, silently, dusting the cottage and the cliffs and the young oak tree they'd planted in the garden. She stood at the window, watching the flakes drift down over the ocean, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the absence of grief, but the quiet knowledge that she'd done what needed to be done. The trunk still sat in the living room, but it no longer felt like a weight. It was just a box now. Leather and brass and history. The letters were inside, carefully arranged, the photographs, the journal, everything Robert Victor had left behind. Claire had offered them to Katya, but Katya had shaken her head. "They belong here," she'd said. "With you. You were his piece. Let him rest with that." So Claire had kept them. Not as secrets anymore, but as stories. She climbed the stairs to the attic one last time. The space felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the air itself had changed. Sunlight streamed through the circular window, illuminating the dust motes that drifted lazily through the room. Claire stood in the center of the floor, where the trunk had sat for so many years, and closed her eyes. She could still feel Robert here, not as a ghost, not as a shadow, but as the truth he'd always been. "I wish you'd told me," she whispered. Her voice echoed softly in the empty space. "I wish you'd trusted me with all of it. With Victor, with Anya, with the boy you were." She paused, her throat tight. "But I understand now why you couldn't." Claire opened her eyes and looked around the attic one last time. She thought about the night she'd found the trunk. The fear and confusion. The shattering realization that she'd never truly known the man she'd loved. But that wasn't true anymore. She did know him. She knew the boy who'd watched his parents die. She knew the young man who'd loved Liesel and lost her. She knew the husband who'd carried 2 lives in one heart, and who'd done it alone because he thought it was the only way to keep the people he loved safe. She knew Victor, and she knew Robert, and she loved them both. Claire walked to the window and looked out at the ocean. The waves were calm today, rolling gently against the rocks, their rhythms steady and sure. She thought about Katya, back in Berlin, rebuilding her understanding of her family. She thought about Anya, who died believing her brother was gone. She thought about Robert, who'd spent 40 years carrying a secret that had finally been set free. And she thought about herself, about the woman she'd been 6 months ago lost, grieving, drowning in questions that had no answers. That woman was gone now. In her place was someone stronger, someone who understood that love wasn't just about what you knew, but about what you were willing to forgive. Claire turned away from the window and walked to the stairs. She didn't close the attic door behind her. She left it open, letting the light spill down into the hallway below. There was no need to lock it anymore. The secrets were gone. That evening, Claire walked down to the shore. The snow had stopped, and the sky was clear and cold, stars beginning to prick through the deepening blue. She stood at the edge of the cliff, the wind tugging at her coat, and held Robert's journal against her chest. She'd read it so many times the pages were soft, the ink beginning to fade, but she didn't need to read it anymore. She knew the story by heart. "You were always enough," she whispered into the wind. "All of you." The ocean roared below, endless and patient. And for the first time since Robert's death, Claire felt him beside her. Not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as the truth he'd always been, flawed and human, and deeply, impossibly loved. Claire stood there for a long time, watching the stars emerge one by one. Then she turned and walked back toward the cottage. The lights were on inside, warm and golden against the darkness. The trunk was there, waiting, but it no longer held power over her. It was just a part of the story now. And the story, finally, was complete. Behind her, the young oak tree stood silhouetted against the sky, its bare branches reaching upward. In the spring, it would bloom, and in the years to come, it would grow strong and tall, its roots sinking deep into the rocky soil. A living memorial to the boy who became a man by learning to carry two lives in one heart. And to the woman who loved him enough to let both of them go, the attic would always hold his secrets, but her heart no longer needed to. Love is not diminished by the secrets we keep, it is deepened by the courage to face them. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give the people we've lost is to finish the story they couldn't tell, honoring not just the life they lived with us, but the life they carried in silence. Truth may hurt, but it also heals. And the past, when finally brought into the light, becomes not a burden, but a bridge between grief and grace.